Hello everyone and welcome to my Kachina guide. She is the newest Geo character in the game, and with all the new changes coming with Natlan, she's shaping up to be a very good Geo unit and one that's ushering in a new wave of Geo supports. So to best maximize her abilities and improvements to Geo, let's get into all the things you need to know about Kachina. So when it comes to her kit, it's quite straightforward. You ignore her basic attacks as she really won't be using them. Instead, you want to focus on her skill and burst, both of which involve her drill machine, which is called Turbo Twirly. Upon tapping her skill, Turbo Twirly will be summoned on field, and Kachina will gain an amount of Nightsoul points while also being in the Nightsoul blessing state. Turbo Twirly will passively attack enemies by slamming on the ground, and with each attack, Kachina's Nightsoul points will be consumed. Turbo Twirly will attack on its own every 2 seconds. It's important to note that Turbo Twirly does count as a Geo construct, so it comes with all the various mechanics Geo constructs normally have, like improving Chiori. Next, you can actually hold her skill as well. Doing so will have Kachina ride Turbo Twirly, and in this state, Kachina's normals will perform Turbo Twirly's slam attacks. The pro of holding her skill instead of tapping it is that Turbo Twirly will perform its slam attacks more often. Instead of 2 seconds, it'll attack constantly. However, this does come at the cost of using up more of Kachina's Nightsoul points. If Kachina uses up all of her Nightsoul points, Turbo Twirly will disappear. As such, in most cases, it's best to use the tap mode of her skill so Turbo Twirly lasts longer on the field and you're able to attack with other units like your DPS. As for her burst, when cast, it'll deal an initial hit of Geo damage and create a field that improves the AoE of Turbo Twirly's attacks, meaning that Turbo Twirly's attacks will reach a farther distance and thus be able to hit more enemies. The movement speed of Turbo Twirly will also be increased if Kachina rides it. Given all these things, Kachina can act as an effective Geo support, which is also tied to her artifacts, but more on this later. Kachina can also be played as a sub DPS. Now for her passives, if a character triggers a Nightsoul burst, which is something that occurs whenever a character deals elemental damage, Kachina gains a really nice 20% Geo damage for 12 seconds. Then, Turbo Twirly's damage is directly increased by 20% of Kachina's defense. With this in mind, when you're leveling up her talents, you should prioritize her skill as you'll be using it a ton, and this is where a huge chunk of Kachina's damage comes from. The same is the case for her burst. It essentially improves her skill and improves her damage, so level it up as much as you can. So with her kit covered, let's get right into Kachina's artifacts, since this is where Kachina becomes insane. When you're building Kachina, you can use a lot of artifact sets, but you need to use the newest set, Scroll of the Hero of Cinder City. This name is too long, so we're just gonna call it Cinder City, but no joke, this set is insane. So right off the bat, the 2-piece gives a direct energy increase to the user, which is nice since Kachina will get her burst more often. Then the 4-piece is where things become amazing. This is where Kachina becomes broken. So when the user triggers a reaction of their element, whichever elements was involved in the reaction produced, party members with those same elements will gain an elemental damage bonus. For Kachina's case, say she triggers Crystallize with Pyro. Any of her party members that are either Geo or Pyro will gain 12% elemental damage bonus. Now if Kachina is in her Nightsoul blessing state, which is easy to do, this is just triggered by using her skill. If Kachina performs Crystallize, instead of getting 12% damage bonus, her party members will gain an additional 28%. So her party members will gain 40% elemental damage bonus for 20 seconds. This is absolutely broken. 40% is huge. It's basically the amount Kazuha gives to his team, and you already know the difference this makes. As such, this makes Kachina an exceptional Geo support to use for really any DPS, but especially Geo DPSs. There's very few ways to increase the Geo damage of Geo units, but Kachina does away with this. She's now an amazing support for any Geo unit in the game. Therefore, you need to use this set because it's so broken. It's an outstanding way to buff your team and is absolutely her best set. If for whatever reason you're not going to use this set, but seriously use this set, it's so good that even if you don't use this set, I'll get irritated and it's not even my account. Or if you're working towards getting this set, which is the only valid reason to not use this set, you can opt for 4 Noblesse to give an attack buff to your team whenever Kachina uses her burst. You could also use for Archaic Petra to mimic the 40% damage bonus of Cinder City, but the thing about this is that the damage bonus won't be applied to Geo units in your team, nor Kachina herself. Tenacity of the Millilith can also be a decent option. This set would also improve crystallized shields to give you some extra protection if you lack a shield. If you're wanting to solely improve Kachina's damage, well, I wouldn't recommend it, but by all means Kachina mains, have your fun. You could instead equip the other new set of Natlan, the Obsidian Codex. This set would directly increase Kachina's damage once she's in the Nightsoul blessing state by a nice 20%. Then when Kachina's Nightsoul points are used, which is very easy to do, Kachina will gain a massive 40% crit rate, so you could build tons of crit damage on her. Next to this set, there's the Husk set to improve her geo damage and defense, both of which are important stats for her. And finally, you can use Golden Troop to increase her skill damage. You could also mix and match the various sets I went over. Real quick, for early game players, use Defender's Will for more defense, Berserker for more crit, or Gambler for extra skill damage. You can also use the various sets that increase energy if you need some. Concerning main stats, run either a defense sands or an energy recharge sands if you need extra energy, a geo damage goblet or defense percentage goblet if you can't get a geo one, and lastly a circlet with either crits or defense. For substats, aim for energy, both crits and defense percentage. Let's now get into what weapons you want to use on Kachina. Being a polearm user, Kachina does actually have a really good option that caters to her kit perfectly, that being the new craftable Natlan Spear. This weapon gives a huge amount of defense both through its secondary stat and its passive, which triggers whenever the user uses their skill, which Kachina will repeatedly do. Since Kachina scales off of defense, this is an all-around best weapon for Kachina and the one you should absolutely use on her. Similar to this weapon is the Battle Pass Deathmatch, which grants crit rate as its secondary stat, and then a nice amount of defense when you're fighting at least 2 enemies. Other than the craftable, this would be the best spear because of its defense. Alternatively, there's the catch to significantly improve her burst damage, while also giving her a really good amount of energy. These polearms are the best if you're trying to improve Kachina's damage and make her more of a sort of sub DPS. The same would be achieved by equipping the Jade Spear, the Staff of Homa, as well as any other of the 5-star polearms that give off crit. However, I'd only recommend to use these 5-star options if these weapons are lying around, since you are better off using them on other units that are more damage focused. Other than this, be it Kachina needs it or your team lacks it, Kachina can use energy-based polearms, like the Favoni Slants, the Skyward Spine to get more energy and a bit of extra crit rate, and finally, the Prototype Star Glitter. If you're in early game, you can make use of any of the early polearms, none of them specifically catered towards Kachina's kit, but the White Tassel would be best for its high crit rate. Next up, let's go over which of Kachina's constellations you want to aim for, and this is another aspect which makes Kachina really good. So the first of her constellations you should aim for is her C1, where whenever Kachina gets on or off Turbo Twirly, she'll gain some energy and absorb any nearby crystallized shards. This occurs every 5 seconds, and overall this constellation isn't the most impactful, but it is useful for its energy increase, which is pretty good. Then aim for her C2. This constellation is actually quite useful, as it's a way to extend the duration of her Turbo Twirly, as when Twirly is on the field and Kachina uses her burst, she'll gain an extra 20 Nightsoul points. If Turbo Twirly isn't on field when her burst is used, Kachina will enter the Nightsoul blessing state and activate Twirly. Now comes her best constellation, which is her C4. This constellation increases the party's defense based on the number of enemies within the field created by Kachina's burst. This constellation is really good, as it's a great way to increase the defense of her teammates, of which will likely be Geo units, so defense scaling units like Ito, Chiori, and of course not to mention Kachina herself. Last but not least, let's cover some great Kachina teams, and I gotta say Kachina is actually quite game changing, since she improves the already existing meta of Geo units, while also improving some forgotten or underperforming Geo teams. Anyhow, the first team I want to mention is an archetype. This is the double Geo, double element team. So here, as was in the past, you're going to use Kachina alongside another Geo unit with another 2 units of the same element. A prime example of this archetype is Benny, Kachina, Navia, and Xiangling. This team is exceptional for two reasons. First off, this archetype plays perfectly into the mechanics of the Cinder City artifact. Here, Crystallize will be easily triggered thanks to Kachina's passive drill hits and Xiangling's Pyronado. This creation of Crystallize will grant these two the huge 40% damage buff as well as Navia. Not to mention that this generation of Crystallize also perfectly caters to Navia, of who wants such things to fire off her skill. Finally, Benny brings this team together as he'll significantly increase the attack of Xiangling and Navia. And then since you have two Pyros on your team, Navia's passive will trigger, giving her another 40% attack. You've also got the Pyro Resonance going on. All in all, this team is legitimately perfect. Everyone here synergizes exceptionally well. You have to try this team out. It's no doubt one of the best teams of Navia. The second team I have for you is another team centered around Itto. And this team we've got Benny, Goro, Itto, and Kachina. This team focuses on buffing Itto as much as possible, which is easy to do given that you've got two of Itto's best buffers, that being Benny and Goro. And lastly, Kachina with Cinder City. Kachina makes a crazy difference in this team, and to Itto since with her he's able to get a significant increase to geo damage. Not to mention a big defense percentage increase if you have her C4. A similar team to this is Itto's Mono Geo team with Chiori. This team is definitely high risk, high reward. You're definitely going to have to be more aware of enemies' attacks since you're not going to have a shield. But you'll also notice the really nice damage increase Kachina will give to both Itto and Chiori. As for those still new to the game, I definitely don't want to leave you guys hanging, so here's an accessible but still effective team to play with. It is a Ningguang team with Benny and Xingqiu. This team would massively buff Ningguang thanks to Benny and Kachina, but it also buffs Xingqiu a great amount too. No joke, if you run this team, so long as you dodge enemies' attacks, you'll defeat anything. Well everyone, this is my Kachina guide. I hope you guys enjoyed, and if you did, please consider liking and subscribing. If you have any questions, be sure to ask me them in the comments, and let me know what do you think of Natlan, because not gonna lie, the power creep is here. Anyways, take care, and thanks for watching.